time, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our critical issue series at Arizona State University School of Social Work. And my name is Liz Lightfoot, and I'm the director here at ASU. And just a little background, ASU is one of the largest schools of social work in a research university in the country. We have 80 full-time faculty, including 42 tenure-line faculty and over 2,200 students. And our faculty and students are doing research often that is at the center of current social concerns, ranging from leading vaccine outreach efforts to underserved populations, to researching refugee resettlement for people fleeing from violence. So we are also very interested in intellectual inquiry and debate into the critical issues of the day that relate to social work and social welfare. And this led to our establishment of ASU's Critical Issues series, where we want to dive into the important issues of the day from a social work perspective. So we are really pleased to be hosting this national webinar today on critical race theory, providing an introduction to critical race theory for social workers. As you likely know, in the last year or so, critical race theory has really become a national issue, and the term critical race theory is now often in the headlines or in the center of political debates. Just yesterday, the Arizona House of Representatives had a debate scheduled on a bill titled the Stop Critical Race Theory and Racial Discrimination in Schools and Other Public Institutions Act, which was aimed to change the Arizona Constitution specifically related to critical race theory. And this bill includes not just K-12, but also higher ed like ASU. The Arizona legislature passed a similar bill last year, but it was thrown out by the Arizona Supreme Court. Likewise, if you were listening to yesterday's Senate hearings on U.S. Supreme Court nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, you heard Senator Ted Cruz asking her in detail about her understanding and her use of critical race theory, complete with large visual aids about CRT. So just from my reading of the language of the state bill in Arizona or listening to the hearing yesterday, it's pretty clear to me that while the term critical race theory is being used a lot in public, legislators don't seem to have a good deal of knowledge about what CRT actually is. But this isn't just legislators. I think this extends to the field of social work too, with social workers, social work students, and even some social work faculty using the term critical race theory without knowing exactly what the term means or where it comes from. And this is why we are very happy to have an expert on critical race theory here to provide an overview of CRT for social workers at our Critical Issues series, Judge Angela Robinson. So Angela Robinson is a visiting professor and a Waring and Carmen Partridge faculty fellow at Quinnipiac University. At Quinnipiac, she teaches evidence and critical race theory. Prior to joining the Quinnipiac faculty, she was a Connecticut Superior Court judge for 20 years, and before that, a trial lawyer with a nationally renowned plaintiff's law firm. She currently serves as counsel at the law firm of Halloran Sage, where she provides ADR services as a mediator, private judge, and arbitrator. And in the past, she also served as the inaugural chief diversity officer at a major East Coast law firm, and is taught as an adjunct faculty member at Gateway Community College, the University of New Haven, and Quinnipiac Law School and Yale Law School. So her work focuses on civil litigation-related subjects and social justice subjects implicated by racial equity issues, including critical race theory, race in the law, and diversity, equity, and inclusion within the legal profession. So Judge Robinson will provide an overview of CRT for us, and after her overview, we will have a question and answer session that will be moderated by ASU Assistant Professor Stephanie Lechuga Pena. And I'll introduce Dr. Lechuga Pena now. So Dr. Lechuga Pena is an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at ASU, and she has more than 20 years of experience in social work practice, working with low-income youth and families. Drawing on critical race theory and Latino critical race theory, she examines parent engagement in low-income and subsidized housing neighborhoods and the barriers of facilitators Latinx youth experience and their educational outcomes. So we're looking forward to a really great discussion here. And before we get started, you notice this is webinar format. And so the way to ask questions is to use the Q&A button down below, and you can use this to start asking questions now, but we'll hold these for the end, and then we'll have a session moderated at the end where you can ask Judge Robinson any question that you want. So I'll turn it now over to Judge Robinson.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I just want to add that I'd be allowed to share my screen. I'm getting a message that it's not letting me do that. Let me see, wait a minute. Okay, got it. So I'm hoping everyone can see the screen. Yes, okay, good. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. Critical race theory is, as you just heard, and you probably know, a very hot topic. It's something that I love to talk to non-academic or non-CRT audiences about because there's been so much misinformation about it. And so before I get started, I want to start, as I always do, especially when I talk about critical race theory, by doing a land acknowledgement. I think it's really important, if we're talking about critical race theory, to start identifying the racial classifications that have been created in the United States to divide us. And one of the first ones was to otherize the Native and Indigenous people who are here. And I'm at a university that's actually named after a Native American tribe, the Quinnipiac tribe. They were an Algonquin speaking tribe in the Northeast. And unfortunately, they do not still exist as an organized tribe, although obviously many people who are of Quinnipiac tribe descent do still survive. So I want to make the acknowledgement that for thousands of years, the Quinnipiac people were residents of this land. They were stewards of this land, and everything that we benefit in Connecticut from, in terms of the beautiful water and lakes and mountains, were really the stewarding, due to the stewarding of the Quinnipiac tribe and other neighboring tribes. And I want to honor and respect the relationship that exists between our land and those people. And we don't have the chat function, but ordinarily I would then invite all of you to put in your chat the Native peoples and tribes you would like to acknowledge. I always say, as a disclaimer, I totally get that making an acknowledgement is not nearly enough. It is more of a symbolic and a first step. So I'm not doing this acknowledgement in lieu of knowing that we have much work to do. So I want to tell you a little bit about the goals I have for today, because we don't have a lot of time. And one of the things that I teach in my critical race theory class at Quinnipiac Law School is that you can't possibly cover critical race theory even in a whole semester. So I'm not going to do it justice in just an hour today. I'm going to give really brief and much more generalized overview than the subject deserves. I'm going to try to dispel some myths about what it is and what it isn't. And then I'm going to provide you with some future resources if you want to learn more. So let's start with the controversy, and also with another disclaimer, and that is the views and opinions expressed are my own. They're not those of my home institution or the law school that I teach critical race theory at. So let's start with the controversy. The controversy actually started within the last few years, when the idea of critical race theory was weaponized for political purposes. So for instance, in 2021, during a 4-month period, critical race theory was mentioned 1,300 times on Fox News. And this was during the time when the pandemic was starting. So it generated a lot of news coverage by conservative media. And as of 2022, the beginning of this year, 7 states had passed bans against critical race theory. And I was saddened to hear that Arizona is going to be joining that group. And 16 states have bills in process. We also know that lots of local boards of education, state boards of education are passing what they call anti-critical race theory legislation. One of the things I think is really, really important to note, though, is that when you get these anti-critical race theory bills, they are also trying to prevent the teaching of sexism and gender discrimination and the teaching of other identity group related topics. So critical race theory is finding its way into the political process, and even, as you just heard, found its way into the judiciary hearings on the confirmation of a United States Supreme Court justice nominee. And all of that should make us suspect, especially those of us in higher education, where we like to promote intellectualism and critical thinking. So I want to take a look at one of the anti-critical race theory bills, because it's very, very much like the kinds of bills that you see. And so it says that this is the one from Wisconsin. It says that it's trying to prohibit the teaching of sexism and race stereotyping. It also says that we don't want sex stereotyping. It also says we don't want to teach that one race is inherently superior to another. Critical race theory does not. It says that we don't want to teach that due to the individual's sex or race, they are inherently racist or sexist. Critical race theory does not teach that. It also says that we don't want individuals to be discriminated against or to receive adverse treatment because of their race or sex. Critical race theory does not propose that. Critical race theory does the next one, I'm not quite sure what that one means, D. And then they also don't want individuals' moral character to be determined by their race or sex. That is not what critical race theory teaches. And they say we don't want to teach that we who are here today bear responsibility for the acts that were committed in the past. That is also not something that critical race theory does. And then finally, doesn't want to teach that systems based on meritocracy or hard work are racist. And that one we need to talk about a little bit more, because that touches on systemic racism issues, and it's not so simply put as is put in this bill. So basically, a lot of what the bill is attacking when it's called critical race theory, anti-critical race theory, is not critical race theory. And the thing that is arguably about critical race theory needs a little more discussion. So the co-sponsor of the bill actually said that the intent of the bill is to ban the teaching of concepts. Now, can you imagine that? The teaching of concepts. To ban the teaching of concepts like social emotional learning. They don't want us to teach about that. They don't want us to teach about diversity, equity, and inclusion, culturally responsive teaching, anti-racism, conscious and unconscious bias, social justice, systemic racism, white privilege, wokeness. Some of these concepts are not critical race theory concepts at all, but it is quite clear that the intent of anti-critical race theory legislation is to shut down any of the possible topics that could lead us to address social justice issues that might implicate race, gender, or sexual orientation. And so when we start talking about what critical race theory is and why it's under attack, we need to remember how the opponents are framing it and what it is they're really trying to do. So critical race theory itself is actually an academic movement. It's an actual movement that started in 1989 in Madison, Wisconsin, among legal academics. And that's very important to remember because it started in legal academia with law professors of color. And so the original workshop convened by organizers Kimberly Crenshaw, Neil Gatanda, and Stephanie Phillips was called Critical Race Theory. And that was Kimberly Crenshaw's contribution. She said she wanted to develop a coherent account of race and the law. So critical race theory was started in order to look at the law and how it intersected and maintained race. So this movement started in 1989, but it actually has its roots that go beyond that period. So it formally started in 89, but it was really built and structured largely around the scholarship and writing of Derek Bell, the late Derek Bell, who was a law professor at Harvard Law School, who started writing about race and the law in the 1970s and 80s. And a lot of his scholarship was foundational to these other scholars who became critical race theory scholars. Originally, the movement was composed of legal scholars of color. It has now expanded. It has scholars of every race, ethnicity, religion, but originally it was brought together by legal scholars of color. It attracted a really diverse group of academics inside and outside legal academia eventually, but initially all within legal academia. Now, what was really interesting about the way this movement launched was that they used an interdisciplinary approach. So even from the very beginning, there was no idea that this was just something that would be confined to the law. They drew upon history, they drew upon literature, they drew upon sociology and social studies and education. And that meant that they were a really diverse group of academics. And there was a lot of disagreement and continues to be a lot of disagreement within the CRT tent over the best way to achieve the goal, which is to remove and remedy racism and racial disparities. It has now expanded to other disciplines, and actually you're going to find more people who are active in critical race theory scholarship who are outside the law than who are inside the law. And it's produced a lot of subspecialties that specifically focus on race and ethnic identities like Asian crit and Lat crit and Native American crit and whiteness studies and multiracial crit and colorism. So it has branched out and established these roots that have given fruit to a lot of different ways to think and talk about race. And that's really what critical race theory is. I did a program recently with another critical race theory scholar who said critical race theory is really a set of questions. It's really a way to ask questions and then to kind of come up with answers. So in its most strict sense, it's not a theory the way we usually use the term theory in academia, but it's a way to look at and address problems of race. Now, to understand how it came to be and how it came to develop, we have to dig a little bit deeper into the history that provided the foundations for it. And so we have to start with things like the history of the ethnic studies programs and movements, because I don't think a lot of students now know that it wasn't until the late 1960s that we even formalized the study of racial and ethnic identity. And that didn't happen without civil protest, social unrest, and agitation. And so, because of the activism of the 60s, colleges and universities finally said, we do need to treat these topics with scholarship and academic inquiry. And so the first ethnic studies program started in San Francisco in 1968. It was a Black Studies program. There was sadly violence and unrest that led to the creation of that program. In fact, the only program that got established without violence was a University of Minnesota program in 1969, where they had formed the Department of American Indian Studies. So it was possible before the late 1960s to get an undergraduate degree without even having the ability to take a class or a curriculum that focused on racial or ethnic identity. And sadly, I think it's still possible to graduate with an undergraduate degree without ever taking one of those classes, even though they are now offered at most, if not all, universities. And so the anti-critical race theory movement, I think my thesis is trying to stop the movement from then going towards primary and secondary education. In other words, we now have formalized programs at the university level, at the graduate school level, but they don't want us to be able to teach about race and identity at the primary school level and the secondary school level. And, so the attacks on critical race theory are very much like the attacks that tried to stop the ethnic studies movement. So critical race theory sort of built upon this model that we can create formal ways to study race, particularly with a focus on law. And so they borrowed from two other movements within legal academia. They borrowed from the critical legal studies movement. We call them in law the original crits. And they borrowed from radical feminists who also had a very strong voice in legal academia. And so I want to talk a little bit about those two foundational movements because they very much provided the structure and approach of critical race theory. So the original crits were the critical legal studies scholars, and they believed that law was not neutral and that legal actors were not unbiased. And so critical legal studies scholars spent years arguing and hypothesizing that the purpose of the law was to maintain the power structure that exists. So they said the people who have money use the law to keep their money. The people who have political power use the law to keep their political power. That is the purpose of law. So we've got to disrupt that. And among the critical legal studies scholars, there were people who focused much more on the economic theories of power in the law. And so they did include Marxists, they did include socialists, they did include people who felt that the capitalist system was the problem. And that's why I tend to think some people have now labeled critical race theory as Marxist. It is not. It is absolutely not. But in the critical legal studies movement, there definitely were people who were Marxist. And so the CRT scholars also looked at the radical feminist movement. The radical feminist movement was the second wave of feminism. If you'll remember, the first wave was the suffragist movement. And that was focused on getting the right to vote. Once that vote had been achieved, feminists took a look at another goal, and that was to remove the power of the patriarchy. So radical feminists, particularly the ones in legal academia, felt that the law maintained the patriarchy. And so we needed to disrupt the patriarchy, and the hierarchy was based on gender. And so both of these movements, the radical feminist movement and the critical legal studies movement, were based on an idea of hierarchy and based on an idea that the law was designed and implemented to maintain the hierarchy. And so we needed to disrupt the hierarchy. So in 1989, when the scholars of color came together, they said, there's something missing about both of these approaches. There is something to this idea that the law is maintaining the status quo. But what we need to focus on is racial inequity. And so if we focus on racial inequity, we can begin to identify the ways that the law maintains it and the law perpetuates it. And so they started to focus on things like wealth and income and residential patterns and representations over and under. And so they started to grapple with certain facts which have been intransigent in the United States. Facts like the fact that the average net wealth of white families is 10 times higher than the average net wealth of Black families. And it's almost 10 times higher than the average net wealth of Latinx families. And the data that I pulled from this study did not actually track or break out the net wealth of Asian American families. But I think that gap has been established for reasons that I'm going to get to when I talk to home ownership. So unlike with the net wealth gap, we have very good data that shows that the home ownership rates of whites continues to surpass that of any other racial group, including Asian Americans. And so even though Asian American home ownership rates has increased greatly in the last 40 years, it's about 60% now, it's still below the home ownership rate of whites. And really interestingly, if we look at the data on Asian households, we see that they have substantially lower homeownership rates than whites, but there's such a great diversity within the Asian community. And so some of the Asian households actually have a substantially less lower homeownership rate than that of even Blacks. We see a persistent income gap that is racially attributable. So we know that the average income of the average white household is about 80,000 versus 49,000 for Blacks and 56,000 for Hispanics. And again, when we get to the Asian group, we have to do an asterisk because you will come across a lot of data which will actually say the income level for Asians is actually higher than that of whites. But again, when you look at the data and you look at the diversity within the Asian American community, you see that there's even a disparity in that community. And I like the study that was done of medical doctors to demonstrate that. There was in the last couple of years a study done of medical doctors to see what the net average income was based on race. And they found predictably that Black doctors on average earned $40,000 less than white doctors. Latinx doctors earned on average $30,000 less, and Asian doctors earned on average $15,000 less. And the study actually controlled for education, experience, and specialty. So when all of those things were true, we still see persistent income gaps based on race. The persistence of racial segregation has to be one of the most troubling aspects of American life because even after all of these decades, after Brown versus Board of Education, after the invalidation of racially restricted covenants, after all of those kind of laws were removed, we still see that we live in primarily segregated neighborhoods. So much so that the average white American lives in a neighborhood that is 80% white. And there is this documented phenomena that happens when a neighborhood gets to 75%. So when 25% or more of the neighborhood becomes non-white, white residents tend to leave. It's called the white flight phenomena. And so the average white American lives in a neighborhood that is 80% white. The average non-white American lives in a neighborhood that is at least 65% non-white. So we are living in segregated worlds, which means we are going to segregated schools. And so nationally, even though more than 50% of the students in public school now are non-white, a majority of all public school students attend schools that are considered racially segregated. And a school is considered racially segregated when over 75% of the students in that school are either white or non-white. So we're living in segregated worlds. We are going to segregated schools, and we are not therefore forming integrated social networks. And so the average white American has 1 out of 10 non-white friends. So 90% of the people in their social network tend to be white. And what does that mean? That means we're living separately, we're educating separately, we're socializing separately. And when we have networks to get jobs, because that's the way most people do get their jobs, we don't draw from integrated networks, we draw from segregated networks. This translates into an over and under representation. So the overrepresentation is in the criminal justice system. If neighborhoods that are predominantly non-white are over-policed, which we know that they are, then you're going to find that you're going to have a higher percentage of non-whites within the criminal justice system, even though there have been studies to demonstrate that racially people commit crimes at about the same rate. They use drugs at about the same rate. They commit crimes racially at about the same rate when we control for all other factors. And so nationally, despite the fact that Blacks and Hispanics only make up about 1/3 of the population, they accounted for more than half of all incarcerated people. And in Arizona, the experience seems to be, from the data that I pulled together just for this, the same kind of experience of disparity that is happening nationally. And so Blacks constitute 18% of people in jail and 14% of people in prison, even though they're only 5% of the Arizona population. And this has happened, this increase of incarceration has happened as the population in prison has become more brown. So the prison population in Arizona has actually increased 695% since 1970. And what's really important to understand, because I think sometimes when we use data, we reinforce the idea that there is something, that there is a different kind of behavior that we can attribute to different races. So, for instance, you might start thinking, well, more Black people are in jail because they commit more crimes. But the population, 74% of the population in Arizona that's in jail are in jail pre-conviction. That's very true in many states. In other words, these are people who've been arrested but never convicted, 74%. And so a lot of them do end up pleading guilty to try to get out. And a lot of them do end up with a criminal record that they don't necessarily deserve or haven't earned. So this overrepresentation of people of color in the criminal justice system translates into an underrepresentation in places of leadership. So if you're in jail, you're not likely in the business world, you're not likely in higher ed, you're not likely on the track to be an elected official. And so 90% of the Fortune 500 CEOs are white men. And in the last 20 years, there have only been 84 CEOs who have not been white. So as of 2021, there have only been 19 Black CEOs out of 1,800 altogether. So if you're in the, if you are not a white American, your chances of leading a Fortune 500 company are greatly diminished. We have statistics that show only 1.3% of all congresspersons have been Black. That's as of 2020. So that means 163 congresspeople have been Black out of a total of over 12,000. This is in 2020. And then I'm talking to people in higher ed, so I think it also bears noting that only 5% of the faculty at colleges and universities are Black. So that's 40,000 out of 750,000. I do want to make the asterisk to say that I did focus on the data for Blacks versus whites because it's easier to get and I don't have a lot of time. But if I had time, I would show that this is not a Black and white issue. This is a race issue. This is a white versus non-white issue. So critical race theory started to look at all of this and question why. Why are we having these persistent disparities when we have removed explicitly race-based barriers from the law? Separate but equal is no longer the law. You cannot legally separate or segregate the races. And we do not have explicitly racist laws on the books like we did. So why now do we continue to have the disparities? And so they came up with 3 basic principles. And like I said earlier, the critical race theory tent is a big tent. So there's a lot of divergent opinions and approaches. But the 3 central tenets that bind all critical race theory scholars together are these 3 principles. First, race is a social construct and not a biological one. Second, racism is pervasive. And remember, I put the little asterisk saying we needed to go back and talk about the idea of systemic racism. And certainly the second tenet is the most controversial, the one that gets the biggest headlines. And then finally, a colorblind approach won't work and can't remedy racism. And so I want to start with the first tenet. The first tenet is that race is socially constructed. It is literally man-made. And I mean man in the gender sense. It was literally men who, in the 1400s and thereafter, created categories called race. There was ancestry before that. There was nationality before that. There were tribes before that. People definitely always noticed differences among people, but there was not something called race to differentiate people. And so that was created by men. And hundreds of years of race science have tried to prove and establish that there is a scientific difference among people of different races. There was even a debate for hundreds of years as to whether Blacks and whites came from the same ancestral, whether we were the same race or whether we were different races. But all of these sciences, all of this study for hundreds of years was never able to document or prove that there is some biological difference among the races. And then in 2000, the Human Genome Study Project finally and definitively showed that humans are 99.9% genetically identical. That means all of you that are on this webinar are 99.9% genetically the same. And then they proved this genome study that the 0.1% is not based on race. So there is that 0.1 variation genetically among people, but it doesn't correlate to racial classifications, which means that people who are classified in the same race may be more diverse than people in different races. So that 0.1 is not race. So it's proven that humans are one race, and it's proven that the variations that we have are not based on race. Now, remember I said ancestry is a real thing. So there are things meaningfully different about people who have different ancestry in terms of their genes and what they inherited and certain traits, physical traits, but those don't correlate to the racial classifications. And so with this principle, that is the first principle of critical race theory, they said, well, if it isn't scientifically based, then it's man-made. And so even though it doesn't exist as a scientific phenomena, it is still real. And sort of that's the head scratcher. Race is not scientifically or genetically based, but race is real. The effects of having classified people by race has created real and meaningful effects on the quality of life. And so just like we saw that there were disparities in all aspects of life, we can see that these disparities are because of socially constructed and man-made constructed devices and rules. So why do these racial disparities persist? The question is one that critical race theory scholars consistently ask and try to answer. And to answer it, they say we have to look beyond the individual actor. We can't just look at individual acts of individual actors, because that's not explaining the disparities. In other words, we don't believe that all white Americans are racist, or that all people of any race act overtly with racist intent that causes these kind of systemic effects. So they said we have to look at systems. We have to look at organizations. Systems and organizations are created by men, and they are established and reinforced by rules and law. And so we have to look at the law to see what kind of systems the law has created to maintain these racial hierarchies. And so there is sort of this debate about how much energy should we spend in trying to get rid of race classifications. In other words, is it worth trying to say we want to just get rid of all classifications, or should we spend our time trying to remedy the harms that that classification system has perpetuated? And so now I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the laws, the structure and the system, the laws that created the structure in the system. So critical race theory says it's not biologically based race classifications, but it is created by man and by rules and by law. And so what are some of those rules and laws? Race was created by rules and laws. Most specifically, one of the ones that comes to mind that is still very much with us today is the US Census. We have had censuses every 10 years for the history of the country, and no two US censuses have ever had the same racial classification. So since 1790, Every census has had different racial classifications and different definitions for how race was constructed. And so, lest you think that this is an old history thing, like, yeah, in 1790, the racial classifications would have been very different from the ones in 2020. No, let's just look at the 2010 census and the 2020 census. In the 2010 census, if you were an Egyptian American, and Egypt is in Africa, you would have likely checked the box for Black, African American, Negro. So there was a white box. I mean, I suppose you could, and some did, but many Egyptian Americans consider themselves African, and so they would check the African American box. There's this really interesting op-ed piece that was written by Dalia Azim, an Egyptian American, where she talks about this. So she would have in 2010 checked the box for African American. In 2020, the census writers specifically created another definition of white. And they specifically said if you were Libyan or Egyptian, you were white. And so if you're Libyan or Egyptian, as this editorial writer discussed, you were supposed to check the white box. So in 2010, you would have been a Black American, and in 2020, you would have been a white American, but you're the same person. And that's because racial classifications are completely man-made. And so they can be changed by man at any time. We've had centuries of history of race-based classifications, and those have had a legacy that lasts with us today. So we have had things like anti-miscegenation laws, which prevented people who were white from marrying people who were non-white. And notice I said it didn't prevent interracial marriage, because some non-white individuals could marry people who were not in their race. The laws were to prevent white from marrying non-white, and perpetuated this idea of racial purity. And we know that that idea continues in 2020, the idea that white is a racially pure race. Because in 2020, if you check the white box and you check another box, which a lot of multiracial people do, you will be accorded to the non-racial classification. So the only reason you would be accorded to the white classification on the 2020 census is if you did not acknowledge any other racial ancestry. If you did, then you would be Black, you would be Hispanic white, you would be Asian. And that is the legacy of this idea of racial purity that was created in the laws that led to things like the anti-miscegenation law. And so these rules and policies and ideas were then reinforced through court interpretation, through the court sometimes actually having to determine who was what race and for what reason. And so not only did the legislatures play a very meaningful role in creating, maintaining, and constructing race, but courts really did. And so this is kind of the beginning of the critical race theory journey. They looked at the law and how laws created and maintained race. And so they looked at cases like People versus Hall, which is an 1854 case. A lot of people are very shocked to know that state courts are distinct from federal courts. And so state law has a whole body of law that is distinct from federal court law. So in 1854, Mr. Hall was convicted of committing a crime, and he was a white defendant. he appealed his conviction, arguing that it was improper because it was based on the testimony of Chinese witnesses. And in 1854, there was a law that said that Blacks could not present witness testimony against whites. It specifically said Black. And so the Supreme Court of California said, well, Chinese are not white, and therefore they are the equivalent of Black, and therefore Chinese are non-white and they're the same as Black, and so they cannot present testimony against white defendants. And so they determined a racial classification. They basically said Chinese were equivalent to Black. And that kind of thing, that kind of interpretation happened all over the United States. And we kind of are comfortable with the idea that it happened in the 1800s, before the 14th Amendment, before the 13th Amendment. But those state racial classifications continued to be on the book as late as the 1980s, when a woman named Susie Guillory Phipps, who had been raised as white and believed she was white, went to get her birth certificate in Louisiana. When she went to get her birth certificate in Louisiana, she found out that on her birth certificate, she was listed as Black. And that was because Louisiana had a very complicated formula for determining who was white and who was Black. And if you were 1/32nd Black, in other words, if you had like a great grandparent who was Black, in Louisiana, you would be deemed Black. And Miss Phipps was 3/32 Black. There was someone generations back in her ancestry who was Black. And therefore, by Louisiana statute in 1983, this woman who had been raised white, who believed she was white, was technically and legally Black. And she sued to get her birth certificate changed and to have the law declared unconstitutional, and she lost. So this woman ended up dying as legally Black, even though she lived, looked, and thought she was white. The law was then amended by the Louisiana legislature, so that's not a problem anymore. But you see my point. My point is that even in the 20th century, even in the late 20th century, laws are still creating and maintaining and defining race. And I'm not sure that we actually will have time to talk about the trio of citizenship cases. So suffice it to say that in the citizenship cases, the court actually had to struggle with defining who was what race. And so in Ozawa in 1923, the United States Supreme Court finally stepped in, because the lower courts have been struggling with this, to say that a Japanese American was not white. And they based that on science, and they based that on common knowledge. Scientifically, Asians, they said, were in a different racial group. And by common knowledge, we know that Asians aren't white. And then 3 months later, Tend, an Indian, sued to become naturalized. And he argued that scientifically, his Indian heritage was in the Caucasoid area. And so he was technically Caucasian, and Caucasian had become known as white. And so he should be deemed white. The court accepted that scientifically Tend would be considered Caucasian, which was considered white, but said we can't rely on science anymore. We have to rely on common knowledge, and common knowledge is Indians are not white. And so we know that Tend is not white. And so how does that translate to today? That translates to today when we're still trying to struggle with how do you define race. And so what was it? A couple of years ago, a man named Ralph Taylor sued to be admitted to a minority business owning program, claiming that he owned a minority business. Now, Mr. Taylor was white, had grown up white, was raised white, but he took a DNA test. And the DNA test revealed that he was 6% Native American and 4% African. And so he said, I'm 10% non-white, and therefore I am a minority. And he went to court to be admitted to this program. And the court, relying on the 10 decision, said, we can't rely on science to determine race because science can't do that. And by common knowledge, you're white. So they denied his claim. So we struggle then with these rules that are inconsistent and man-made to try to figure out how the law is maintaining race. And a lot of people in the 20th century said the way to do that, the way to remedy racial disparities, is to apply a colorblind approach. And you'll remember that was the third tenet of critical race theory. The first is race is a social construct. The second is racism is pervasive. And the third is a colorblind approach will not work. The legal colorblind doctrine came from the dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson, where Justice Harlan said our Constitution is colorblind. Ironically, he said that in a decision in which he was saying the white race deems itself to be the dominant race in the country, and so it is in prestige and achievements in education and wealth and power. And so we don't need to have race in our Constitution because the white race is superior and it will always be. And he actually ended up being right because we have removed race-based restrictions and we see that we haven't remedied the disparities. And so the white race is still the dominant one in terms of achievement, education, wealth, and power. But on the social science end of things, people like Margaret Mead popularized the notion of colorblindness. It's a very idealistic and seductive idea. It sounds great to say we're colorblind. But even she, at the end of her career, came to realize that that is impossible and that that is ill-advised. And so she renounced her approach that used colorblindness. And so now I want to loop back to what critical race theory is and how it gets applied. It has these three basic tenets, and it uses a new approach to try to look to see how the law and rules are maintaining racial hierarchy. And it drew from this idea of Audre Lorde that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so it said, we can't just use the traditional legal approach to undo racism. We have to create new ways. And so they use things like storytelling and narrative and counter storytelling. They use things like interest convergence, anti-essentialism, and racial schemas. And I'm happy to talk more about that if you have questions about that. And so critical race theory used these new approaches in a very nuanced and academic way. And so that's why critical race theory is usually an upper level class. You know, it is not even something you're going to encounter in college. In fact, the critics of critical race theory acknowledge that only about 300 colleges and universities actually have a class called critical race theory. And that's because you really need to have a very good understanding of US history and of laws and how laws are created and why they're created. You need to have some political science understanding because these are very complicated and nuanced issues. They don't lend themselves to sound bites, as I hope I have taught you. And so a lot of the anti-critical race theory people are intoning Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, in which he said, I want my children to be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, without acknowledging that the other parts of that speech are fully consistent with critical race theory, and that he had made other statements to show that he would be very much against the anti-critical race theory movement. And so he said in 1967, whites, it must frankly be said, are not putting in a similar effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It's an aspect of their sense of superiority that white people of America believe they have so little to learn. And it goes on. So I like this end quote, which is going to take us towards the end of my presentation so that we can have a discussion, because it kind of treats race the way critical race theory treats it. Like citizenship, race is a political system that governs people by sorting them into groupings based on invented biological demarcations. Race is not only interpreted according to invented rules, but more important, race itself is an invented political grouping. Race is not a biological category that is politically charged. It is a political category that has been disguised as a biological one. The very step of creating race is a political practice. And so, briefly, here's what it is not. Critical race theory is not taught in primary or secondary schools. It's not the teaching of history, geography, or social studies. It is not Marxist, socialist, communist. It's not pro-democratic or anti-Republican. In fact, critical race theory are very critical of both the liberal and conservative approach to race. Critical race theory is not anti-white. It's seeking to dismantle the racial hierarchy, not to reorder it. So the idea of critical race theory is not to make white people feel badly about their race, and it's not to make people in general feel badly about America. It's about trying to find a way to use law, to look at law and the intersection of law to find out why these racial disparities continue when there's no biological or scientific basis for them. And then finally, critical race theory is not new. It's been around for decades, more than 3 decades. And so if it was really a threat to our nation or to our country, we would definitely know it by now. And so I'm going to open it up to questions, but I want you to see that even if the anti-critical race theory movement does succeed in getting certain laws passed, I don't think they're going to be upheld, because a lot of critical race theory concepts are already very mainstream. Things like storytelling, things like intersectionality, things like unconscious and implicit bias, these are here to stay. They're a part of the mainstream dialogue. And so if you want to learn more, there's some preparatory reading. So the books on this list are not technically critical race theory books, but they get you ready to start grappling with the law review articles and the scholarly articles that are on them. And if you're like me, sometimes you prefer to watch things. And so there's a really good video called An Overview of Critical Race Theory that actually interviews Derek Bell that was published in 2014. I am a huge fan of Race, the Power of Illusion. It's a 3-part PBS documentary from 2003. And then I assign all of my classes to watch these other videos. So I invite you to contact me if you want to follow up on any of this discussion offline, or if you're interested in delving a little bit more deeply, please definitely reach out to me. And now I'm hoping that we've reserved enough time so that we can actually have kind of an interesting discussion. And so I want to thank you. I also want to let you know that I am going to be forwarding a Google form. I thought I could get it into the chat to get some feedback from this, and I think I'll do it through Dean Lightfoot, if that's okay.
Sure, you can put it in the chat. They can see it.
Okay, I'll I'll try to do that then. And so let's have a discussion. Let's talk. I gave
Thank
you a
you.
lot of information.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We had a lot of questions beforehand, and we've had some coming on. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. LaChuca Pena to start off with the questions and comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Judge Robinson, I really enjoyed hearing more from your perspective as a legal scholar and judge. I'm a social worker and
Yes.
educator. And so I think it's important that we understand the history of the United States, and within that context, the history in social work and our role in systemic oppression and supporting white supremacy. As I was preparing for this, I thought to my experience and how I found critical race theory.
Okay.
I was in my social work doctoral program, and I was very interested in academic outcomes for Latinx students and trying to understand what's happening within the education system and within families. I couldn't find a particular theory or framework that did it justice. And so I looked in education and found critical race theory and henceforth LACRIT in education. And this was about 10 years ago. So I made it a point to bring critical race theory in my research scholarship and teaching now that I am faculty. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts about one of the things that you said is it's not new, yet it is newer to social work. And I think a lot of it comes from what's been happening with the news and our former president's ban on critical race theory or attempt to ban it. So your thoughts about why social workers or social work might think this is a newer theory or framework?
It's really interesting to me. And can I just say, I don't know that I said this at the beginning. I am the daughter of a social worker. So my late father was a psychiatric social worker. So I have a very strong fondness for social work and the community good that it can do. I think it is new to many people, including social work, because it really has been much more of an academic sort of based approach to the law. And so it doesn't naturally seem like it would apply, although it has brilliantly applied, as you just said, in other arenas. And I'm not sure, I was disheartened to find out that it was so new to social workers. Like, I thought that it would be a required class by now, not necessarily critical race theory, but a class that included teaching critical race theory and race and identity. So I can't explain why it's taking quite so long to get to a discipline that seems like a perfect pairing for it.
Right. And I think to what you had mentioned in your talk is people don't feel as well versed in it. And so they're afraid to say the wrong thing, teach the wrong thing, and then even engage in these conversations with students that bring up their own experiences of racism or things that they've experienced with different types of discrimination and oppression.
Yes.
So that makes complete sense.
Yeah, but that's all the more reason to teach it. I mean, that's you in your classes, that's where you get to explore and try out and ask questions and learn.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. So it sounds like this is a call to social work to be engaging in these conversations, not only amongst each others, but with the future generation of social work students and practitioners. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And as you can tell, I think from my conversation, it doesn't lend itself to sound bites. It's hard to come up with a succinct response, especially since I say it's like trying to nail Jello. I mean, it's because the arguments are always moving and they're moving to many different things.
Right. We have several great questions from our audience. And so I want to start with one that I think is really important. Why are people so afraid of talking about critical race theory or hearing about critical race theory in their schools? Or
I think a lot of it has to do with racial anxiety about talking about race in general. I don't think we are taught how to talk about race. I don't think we're taught to feel comfortable, especially in interracial environments. So if you have a room full of people of one race, maybe they would feel more comfortable. But to talk about it publicly, people are afraid, one, they're going to be misperceived, misunderstood, called racist, and two, they don't want to feel uncomfortable.
Mhm.
If not talking about race is comfortable to you, why are you going to talk about race?
Right. I totally agree with that. What might you say is the best way to respond to the inappropriate use of critical race theory in legislative debates and all the attempts to ban critical race theory?
Yeah, I that's what I was responding to, and I said there's no easy answer, but I do think it bears persistently saying that's not what critical race theory is. What you're talking about is not critical race theory. We can talk about what you're talking about, but it's not critical race theory. And I think we just have to continue to beat that drum. That's not critical race theory, because what has happened is it's actually made people afraid to even acknowledge that they want to learn about it. I was really sad in the confirmation hearings with Judge Jackson at how strongly she had to disavow any knowledge of critical race theory. Like, I don't know what it is. I don't use it. I mean, I don't, it's sort of like saying, I don't know what law and economics is. I don't, yes, you know what it is, you might, but it's become such a radicalized concept. People are getting scared to even say, I do know what it is and I want to learn about it. I want to talk about it. And so we have to push back on that and say we should want to know about it.
Right. I mean, so many of, you mentioned before, 7 states are working on banning critical race theory. And then you ask them, can you tell me what critical race theory is? And they don't know. They don't have a
They don't
response
know.
for it. And so they're
They
banning
don't know.
something.
They don't know. And I usually say in this, but I think it's a given because y'all are intelligent. This is just one approach. I mean, you don't have to actually want to adopt it wholesale, like you, I think, said you use parts of it in your work, but that doesn't mean you agree with everything that's critical race theory. So it's one approach. You don't have to adopt it, but you should know about it.
Agreed. Someone asked, I live in a state that is trying to ban critical race theory. Arizona is actually one of those. I don't believe, to my knowledge, that they're using critical race theory, but the intent is in regards to banning critical race theory. What can we do to be engaged in this conversation, or to, just have more knowledge about it?
I think political activism is going to be necessary here. We definitely need to have coordinated efforts to give testimony, to meet with our legislators, to educate them, to rally parents. Parents really have been the biggest constituency on this, but I do have to say, because in Wisconsin, I looked, the movement against critical race theory is not coming from the public. So when Pew polls are done, the public isn't saying we want to ban critical race theory. And so I think it's really important to mobilize that and to show the legislators, because they're supposed to be representing the voters, this isn't what the voters want. This is what a small group of activated partisans want. But most Americans are not rallying for us to ban anything. I mean, the fact that we're talking about bans is quite frightening to me.
Right, I agree. One of those follow-up questions is, we have many social workers that work in schools as school social workers, and we are hearing it in the news, how CRT is being taught to K through 12, and it's teaching white students that they are racist. And we actually know it's not necessarily being taught in K through 12. As you mentioned before, it's being taught in higher education and from well-versed faculty and professors that know this content. So as a school social worker, are those working in schools, why do you think it's kind of trickling down to this K through 12 debate about whether or not it should be taught or not be taught or should be banned? And we should be talking about, we shouldn't be talking about our differences, but we should be talking about how we're so similar.
Yeah, so it's complicated, as is everything. And I'm not an expert on K through 12 education, but my understanding is that a lot of curriculum, a lot of school districts are trying to expand their curriculum at the same time as this is going on. And so they are trying to increase the reading list to have more diverse authors. They are trying to teach history in a more broad way. And that is being conflated with teaching critical race theory, which is making parents uncomfortable. But again, it's not my area of specialty. So what would I say? I'd say keep telling parents they're not teaching critical race theory. And I think it's really important to turn it on them and say, well, what should we be teaching our children about race? You know, so you don't want to teach critical race theory. What should we teach? Because I don't think they've been required to answer that question. The people who are the proponents, they just talk about what they don't want you to teach.
That's a really good point. Another question that keeps coming up is in the context of some of the critiques of critical race theory. Yes. And whether or not it's an appropriate framework. And again, this might be outside of your expertise, but could this more legal, because it comes from legal studies and more academic framework, be used in social work practice?
Yeah, it could.
And
it definitely could.
And I'm just thinking about, I mean, in social work, there are multiple systems that communities and clients that we work with are engaged in. Housing, education, immigration, child welfare, mental health, well-being. And so while it's an academic framework, or perhaps we're newer to it, it definitely is relevant in thinking about primarily folks of color, BIPOC communities that we work with, and how to help us understand some social issues and social problems.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of the movement was they wanted it to be practical. So even though it is very academic, the scholars wanted it to be used in practice in other disciplines. So I think it is an ideal framework to apply. You know, you can use the intersectional framework, and I think you do. I think social workers are trained to, you know, you don't just treat the woman identity separately from the ethnic identity, separate from the race identity. I mean, there's intersectional approaches, and I think you also apply the storytelling narrative approach where you elevate the personal stories. Like it is, you are treating an individual who has an individual experience, and you need to know what that is. And so their story is important. So there are definitely ways that it has practical application. And then the implicit unconscious bias stuff, you must get trained on that. No?
We do. We first year students and advanced standing, they are required to take a diversity course. And I'm going to say at our university, as one of the lead instructors for diversity, we engage in a lot of understanding our own identities, both privileged and oppressed, and how we need to understand what we call our positionality when working with communities and clients, and how that informs our lens. So yes, across social work, diversity and oppression courses are required. And in particular at ASU, I've really honed in on some of these frameworks, critical race theory, and the extensions of it, because as you are aware, some of the critiques are that it really is a black-white binary from its initial development. And so other scholars and academics have really pushed to kind of be more specific with Lat crit, tribal crit, discrit, indigenous crit.
So this is where, and I thank you so much for saying that, because this is where I think critical race theory actually could be a benefit. We do tend to talk in terms of privilege and oppression a lot when we talk about anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that is a very uncomfortable binary, because if you are white and privileged, that implies you're also an oppressor. And so I try very hard when I'm teaching critical race theory to explain that that binary of the individual oppressor is really not the framework critical race theory starts with. So the structure, the system has been developed in a way that may oppress groups, but even that becomes challenging. And it has been constructed in a way that privileges certain race. But I try to avoid that that model, because I do think that that shuts people down. I mean, I wouldn't want to be considered an oppressor. You know, even I don't, like, I'm not going out trying to oppress people, even though I know as a Christian, I am privileged in this country. And I do know that people who are Jewish or Muslim may be oppressed by certain systems, but I don't want to see myself as the oppressor of them. So I think it's really important for us to find ways to talk that bring people in.
I agree. I mean, when I talk with students, and the reason I decided to be a social worker is we want to help others. We want to be a facilitator of change.
Right.
And if we come into this profession, right, with guilt or this, what you said, like, we don't want to be an oppressor.
Right.
But it's a way for us to understand systems and how they've been created previously based on laws that were racially based. And now, while we don't have them in practice, well, I guess we don't actually have them written, but we also know it continues to happen in race and racism. So I think I agree. You have to have a space where you can have these honest conversations where people don't feel guilty, but understand about different privileges that they bring in. Right.
Absolutely. So well put.
And one of the questions was about that is, let me go to it. How does one diffuse white guilt when it swims to the surface when talking about critical race theory?
I've talked to a number of speakers who definitely have thought about this a lot more than I have. I don't think personal guilt of this is of service, but acknowledging that there's work to do and inspiring a feeling that maybe I'm not where I need to be is a good thing. So I don't want, and I try very hard when I use white to not make it seem like I'm talking about all white people, but I'm not trying to say that white people should feel guilty because they're benefiting, because they didn't create the structure, you inherited it. But I do think it merits saying, why haven't I taken a little more time to learn about race and to learn about racial equity, and what can I be doing to be better informed?
I agree. Exactly what you said is, when we focus on guilt, it's definitely a natural and normal response. However, that doesn't help us move forward in creating change, systemic or at the individual level. And that's one of, our values in social work, is to be an advocate. And so moving beyond guilt and shame to understanding what privileges we bring that we can then use to the benefit of others, those clients that we're serving, communities that we're serving, and to be an ally. We can't do this work alone. The majority of our field is white social workers, and they are our allies.
Right.
And that's
And
how
it's interesting because we all have vulnerabilities. That I do diversity equity work in another space, and my struggle, and I just realized, is I didn't introduce my preferred pronouns. I didn't put that in my description. That is a privilege that I have, that I don't have to do it, because my preferred pronouns are what people generally assume, but I can't let myself off the hook for that.
Right. And I agree, often we don't think about the privileges we hold. And so, right, as someone who's educated, as someone who's cisgender, able-bodied, it's important to not only acknowledge our oppressed identities, but also the privilege we hold as well.
That's right.
I know I only have maybe a couple of minutes left, but any other thoughts, or social work is all about responding to social problems, being able to really advance our field. Any words of wisdom or suggestions on pushing forward, perhaps with critical race theory in social work?
So I'm talking today about critical race theory, so I am definitely focusing on race. And so I would say that make it a practice to try to ask, what does race have to do with this in every situation? And it seems oppressive at first, but when you start doing that, your lens starts to change and you start to see race in almost everything. And that is the first way to correct it. You can't correct something you don't see. And so what does race have to do with it is the question I'd encourage you to ask every day.
I love that, Judge Robinson. I'm assuming it's a play on what's love got to do with it? But what's race got to do with it?
It is, I didn't invent it. And someone said, can you see my dog? So we've got a few little minutes, and she decided to climb up on my lap. But yeah, it is, but it's a catchy phrase, right? What's race got to do with it?
Thank you so much, Judge Robinson.
Sure.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Lechuga Pena, for your great moderation. It was such an interesting discussion to listen to, and the presentation was fabulous. We are going to go back and get your lists of references, and videos, and send them out to everyone. And I believe your question got sent out in the chat to everyone. And I'm also going to send out something right now because we have another one of these critical issue series seminars next Monday on voting rights. So we like to jump right into the important issues of the day. So we've got some great folks joining us. We've got Terry Mizrahi, who's from the Voting as Social Work project to encourage social workers to get involved in voting. And we've got someone from the Arizona Secretary of State's office who's going to talk about the numerous bills in Arizona that they're currently considering to limit voting rights. And I do have to say, Judge Robinson, we haven't actually passed the anti-critical race theory bill yet, and they're trying to change the Constitution. So if they pass the bill, then it will go to a statewide vote. And our NASW of Arizona is very involved in this and sending out action alerts. So we are looking at this, and hopefully we'll fight this. So all of this is kind of related, but I want to thank you very much for your talk today. And I know we all enjoyed it. And as I was saying to Judge Robinson before, I'd heard her talk before, and I knew she was the best person I'd ever heard talk about critical race theory. So we're so happy you could come and share your knowledge with all of us. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'm clapping, and I'm sure everybody else is clapping. We just can't see them.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Good. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.